Hello and welcome to another episode of the DigiTeacher Digest. This week I'd like to continue looking at the book by Carl Mayton, Knowledge of Knowers, and the different dimensions of legitimation code theory that he sets out in that book. So in previous episodes we've looked at the dimensions of specialization and semantics. Autonomy is a little bit harder to explain, I think, and if you look at the terms used, so for specialization, there's always something which is known, knowledge, and there's always a knower, someone who is doing the knowing. That uses fairly common language, fairly concrete language. In terms of semantics, gravity, how context dependent a knowledge claim is. Is it concrete and contextualized, or is it abstract and generalized? Or how simple or complex something is. Density are terms which are fairly easy to understand. In autonomy, it gets a little bit more abstract and rarefied. So in autonomy, Carl talks about positional autonomy and relational autonomy. How constituent parts of a practice are positioned and how constituents are related together. So I think one of the easiest things is to kind of go through an example to see how it works. So when we're thinking about positional autonomy, we're thinking about how insulated the constituent parts of something are from each other. So the top example is obviously mathematics. I don't think you could mistake it for anything else. But the one at the bottom, is it maths or is it cricket? Well, a cricket ball flying through the air describes a parabola and you can calculate that mathematically, but it's also quite obviously cricket. The insulation is much weaker. So we can describe positional autonomy as being either stronger or weaker. So something is obviously mathematics, everything, all the constituents are maths, or they involve other things as well. A useful way of thinking of relational autonomy, how constituent parts are related to each other, is to think about its purpose. So are you studying the arc of a parabola in order to study mathematics, or are you doing it to catch the cricket ball? I was always amazed as a child that if you saw the top of the arc, you would be able to close your eyes and still catch the cricket ball. Or in my case, not. It usually hit me on the head. So something can be described as having weaker relational autonomy. Its purpose is weak to the target, or stronger relational autonomy. Its purpose is right on target. So in the usual LCT fashion, you should be getting used to this by now, if you lay these out in a matrix, then you get 4 quadrants which describe different codes, different autonomy codes. So the first code is called the sovereign code. So that's very much doing maths for the purposes of doing maths. So you're studying the maths curriculum, doing a topic in maths in order to study maths. The exotic code would be when something is happening in the classroom which has got nothing to do with maths and doesn't appear to be related to any attempt or any goal of studying mathematics. Talking about cricket, for example. But with the introjected code, what you get is that something which isn't really about mathematics, doesn't really belong in mathematics, is being used for the purpose of studying mathematics. For example, the parabola of a cricket ball to study parabolas. And finally, the projected code is where you're studying mathematics, for example, but for a different purpose. So maybe mathematics so that you can become an engineer or something like that. So enough of the kind of theory, how do we use it in the classroom? One thing that teachers often do is to take tours through these autonomy codes. So for example, I start in the sovereign code, I'm teaching mathematics, I'm teaching the maths of a parabola, and then I move into the exotic code and I start discussing cricket and how the arc of a cricket ball works. I've moved into not talking about maths, I'm now talking very much about cricket. So I've toured from sovereign to exotic code. And then the teacher will try and turn that discussion to purpose, discussing the arc of a cricket ball in order to look at the mathematics of the parabola. So we've moved now into the introjected code. And if all goes well, this discussion will lead back to our target, what we were trying to learn after all, which is the mathematics of the parabola. So we're back firmly in the sovereign code. This tour is a very common one. These autonomy tours can be very powerful pedagogically. So using something like cricket in order to help inform study of mathematics can be very, very powerful. And if things just stayed in the sovereign code the whole time, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, etc. But I remember from being a boy at school, very often things would go into the exotic code. What about the rugby on Saturday, sir? And then it would just remain with the rugby and wouldn't go back to whatever lesson we were trying to study. We did that a lot. Cause teachers to go into the exotic code and just stay there. So you want to see the tour. You want to bring in extra things to spice up the lesson and help students to understand what's going on. But you want to bring them back to purpose and back to the target of study, which is mathematics or science or whatever it is. And for me, looking at autonomy in this way, seeing it as a tour across different codes is very useful for computer teachers when thinking about our practice. So let's say I want to teach coding. So I'm going to teach it perhaps using block coding at a certain age, moving to text-based coding, but I've got my curriculum, a series of concepts that I want to teach, things like variables and loops. And all of that is pretty much in the sovereign code. Computing as a subject. I'm teaching coding in order to teach computing concepts, in order to teach coding. But another way of thinking about the computing curriculum is to move it off into the exotic code. So instead of having computing as a subject, you might have computing as part of a STEAM or STEM unit, or problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning, whatever you call it. Basically, you're working on real world, real problems, and you are teaching the coding element as a tool for solving those problems. So the focus in the curriculum shifts to the exotic code. Or within a computing class, you might, much like the maths teacher might bring in a bit of cricket in order to teach the parabola, you might bring in a problem and then get the students to code in order to solve that problem. So, for example, challenges like the microbit Do Your Bit challenge, where students are posed to come up with solutions and prototypes using the microbit and using coding to solve real-world environmental problems or health problems or whatever it is. And that represents a move back into the introjected code, because in order to do that, the student will need to learn some coding and to be able to apply that. And so whether it's part of a cross-curricular, problem-based learning, general STEM kind of approach to the curriculum, or whether it's part of a narrowly focused computing as a subject curriculum. If your target is the teaching of coding, then when you're doing that, you're back in the sovereign code. So to my mind, the autonomy tour as a concept becomes a tool for helping me think about the curriculum and help me think about the approaches that I'm using when teaching. When do I want to move into the exotic code? When do I want to move back into the introjected code and back into the sovereign code to complete that tour is a useful kind of curriculum decision. It helps me plan my syllabus, helps me plan out a unit of work and a module of work, and how to bring in real-world problems as part of that. And of course, I think the move into the projected code, where you're doing coding, but it's for other purposes. Why are we teaching kids coding? Why should we teach all kids coding? Should we do that? You can teach coding, but what does that actually give a child? Is it giving a logical approach, teaching them to be precise, to be orderly? Is it teaching them to be creative and solve problems? Why are we teaching coding in the first place? So what I think is very useful about the autonomy tour as a concept, and what it gives me as a cognitive tool, is an awareness that you should be covering the whole plane. You can't just stick in the sovereign code. You can't just teach maths, 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 maths without moving into the exotic. So that students understand what you're talking about. There need to be real-world applications, metaphors, analogies, and so on, so that students can understand the mathematics. But also, you need to move into the real world for solving problems. Coding, after all, is a way of solving problems and setting problems with projects like the MIT Apps for Good challenge, or the microbit environmental challenges, and so on. It's good to move into the exotic code, to look at real-world problems so that you're trying to apply the knowledge that you have to a different situation. And it needs to be brought back to purpose, because ultimately you're trying to learn coding so that it's useful in the world in some way. And so you need that complete tour through all of those codes. I think one of the problems with things like multidisciplinary approaches or problem-based approaches is that there's a kind of dilemma at the center of it. So if you're taking a multidisciplinary approach, cross-curriculum approach, teachers will talk about, okay, so they're going to do this project and they're going to use their maths and they're going to use their geography and they're going to use their computer programming. But if the students don't have those skills, if they don't have those disciplines firmly in place, then they have nothing to use in solving the problem. So you need to teach maths, you need to teach coding, you need to teach geography. Only then will students be able to use that knowledge in a kind of cross-curriculum, problem-based approach. And I think you need to bring it back so it enriches that curriculum, enriches the maths curriculum, enriches the coding curriculum. And you also need to be thinking about what is the purpose of it all. Why are we teaching coding? What are the core values and principles, the key dispositions that we want students to have? Do we want them just to be producing good coders? Well, probably not as narrow as that, or we wouldn't be teaching it to all students. It's probably more about teaching kids to be good problem solvers and to be creative. And you need to give them exposure to that. So you need to move into the exotic code and have your problem-based learning. But that problem-based learning needs to be supported with solid disciplinary learning. And that's my 2 cents worth. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you never miss an episode again.